The morning of May 28, 1945. Deep within the forests outside Moscow, at a proving ground the world would come to know only as Kubinka, Soviet engineers stood in a circle around a machine that shouldn't exist. Not here, not in their hands. Heavy Tank T-26E3, serial number 30119961, an American Pershing, fresh off the ship from Murmansk, its olive drab paint still unmarred, its 90mm gun gleaming in the pale spring light. For weeks, rumors had circulated through the technical institutes and design bureaus. The Americans were sending one of their new heavy tanks, their answer to the Tiger, their counter to the Panther, the tank that arrived too late to change the war in Europe, but early enough to change everything the Soviets thought they knew about American engineering. Major Nikolai Fedorov, chief ballistics engineer at the proving grounds, walked slowly around the hull, notepad in hand. He paused at the gun mantlet, ran his fingers across the cast armor, 102mm thick, the same thickness as their own IS-2's turret front. But something felt wrong. The Americans called this a heavy tank. The paperwork accompanying the shipment designated it as such. Weight, 46 tons. Crew, 5. Main armament, 90mm high-velocity gun. On paper, it looked formidable. In person, standing next to it, comparing it mentally to the IS-2 that sat in the adjacent testing bay, Fedorov felt a creeping sense of disappointment. This was supposed to be America's best. This was supposed to be the tank that would make German Panthers obsolete. And yet, as his team began their measurements, as they recorded every dimension, every plate thickness, every weld and casting seam, the numbers told a story the Americans perhaps didn't intend to tell. The front hull, 101.6mm, sloped, yes, but cast armor, not rolled plate, the Soviets had learned years ago that cast armor, while easier to manufacture, was inherently weaker than properly hardened rolled steel. A Tiger's 88mm gun could defeat this at ranges beyond 1,000 meters. The side armor, 76mm, less than an IS-2, less, even, than the improved KV-1 models from 1943. The testers looked at each other. This was a heavy tank? According to Soviet doctrine, established through bitter experience on the Eastern Front, a heavy tank needed at minimum 120mm of frontal armor. The IS-2 had precisely that. The IS-3, already in production, had even more. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Fedorov wasn't ready to judge yet. Perhaps, he thought, the Americans had put their faith elsewhere. Perhaps the gun would compensate for the armor. The 90mm M3, a weapon derived from their anti-aircraft guns, much like Germany's feared 88. The barrel was long, 53 calibers. The bore evacuator suggested modern design thinking. Ammunition had been a problem. The tank arrived without any shells. But the Soviets had M1 anti-aircraft guns, captured from Lend-Lease shipments, and their ammunition proved compatible. 3 types of projectiles were prepared for testing. The M82 armor-piercing capped shell, standard American anti-tank round, muzzle velocity, 810 meters per second, weight, 10.9 kilograms. The M77, an improved armor-piercing shot, and most intriguingly, a handful of T-30E16 rounds, high-velocity armor-piercing, tungsten core, muzzle velocity exceeding 1,000 meters per second. The Americans called it HVAP. The Soviets called it scarce. Only 6 rounds existed in their inventory for this particular gun. By early June, the Pershing was ready for live fire. Testing. The trials program was comprehensive. Mobility, automotive performance, crew ergonomics, armor protection, and finally, the question that mattered most, penetration capability. A series of armor plates were positioned downrange, 82mm thick, 100mm, 120, all set at various angles, 50 degrees from vertical, 60 degrees, the German standard of 30 degrees from horizontal. June 12th, the first day of ballistic testing. Fedorov stood in the observation bunker, binoculars trained on the target array 700 meters distant. The Pershing's engine rumbled. Inside, a Soviet crew, trained hurriedly on the tank's foreign controls, prepared to fire. The Americans had provided technical manuals. The turret traverse was powered, 360 degrees. Electric hydraulic, faster than the IS-2's manual system. The gun elevated smoothly. The loader, Sergeant Pavel Orlov, struggled with the American shells, 24 pounds each, heavy but manageable. The breech was semi-automatic, different from Soviet designs, but functional. Fire, came the order over the radio. The 90mm gun roared. The report echoed across the test range. Downrange, the 82mm plate, angled at 50 degrees, shuddered. A hole. Clean penetration. Fedorov nodded. Expected. The German 88 could do the same. Target 2. 100mm, 30 degrees from horizontal. Reload. 10 seconds. Longer than an 85mm on a T-34. Slower than the Americans' own propaganda suggested. Fire. Another flash. Another impact. This time, the result was different. Penetration. But barely. The shell had punched through, but the hole was ragged. The plate showed cracking around the impact site. At ranges beyond 1,000 meters, Fedorov calculated mentally. This gun would struggle against angled 100mm armor. The target most people feared was next. A plate, simulating a Panther's glacis. 80mm, sloped at 55 degrees. Effective thickness, 140mm. This was the plate that had humiliated American 76mm Shermans throughout France and Germany. This was the armor that made German tankers arrogant. Fire. Impact. No penetration. The shell struck, gouged the surface, and bounced, ricocheted upward into the tree line. Silence in the observation bunker. Fedorov felt his stomach tighten. They had tested the standard M82 round, the round American tankers carried most often, and it could not defeat a Panther's front. Not from 700 meters, not from this angle. Try the HVAP, someone suggested. The next round was loaded. One of only 6, T-30E16, tungsten carbide penetrator, 3 times the cost of a standard shell. Reserves so limited that American crews were given fewer than 10 rounds per tank. Fire. The crack was sharper, higher velocity. The impact, catastrophic. The simulated Panther plate didn't just perforate, it shattered. The tungsten core, traveling at over 1,000 meters per second, drove through the sloped steel like a nail through wood. Complete penetration. But Fedorov wasn't celebrating. He was calculating. How many of these rounds does an American tank carry? He asked. According to intelligence reports, between 5 and 10. And how many Panthers might they face in a single engagement? No one answered. The math was obvious. If every American Pershing carried, optimistically, 10 HVAP rounds, and if Panthers operated in platoons of 5, then even with perfect accuracy, a single Pershing could only definitively defeat 2 Panthers before reverting to standard ammunition, and standard ammunition couldn't penetrate the front. The testing continued over the following weeks. Mobility trials through forest terrain, automotive endurance over 200 kilometers, the Ford GAF engine, 650 horsepower, designed for the 30-ton Sherman, now expected to push 46 tons. The result? Predictable. Underpowered. The Pershing's average speed cross-country, 18.9 kilometers per hour, the IS-3, 17.5, the Panther, 15.8. The Americans had barely kept pace. The report began to take shape. Fedorov wrote carefully, knowing his words would reach not just the design bureaus, but Marshal Zhukov's desk, perhaps even Stalin himself. The heavy tank T-26E3 demonstrates several positive qualities: power traverse, reliable transmission, adequate crew visibility. He paused, drew a line. However, that single word carried the weight of Soviet expectations. The armor protection is insufficient for a vehicle designated as a heavy tank. Front hull thickness, 101.6 millimeters, falls short of the minimum 120 mm established by GABTU requirements. The cast armor, while convenient for manufacture, lacks the hardness of properly treated rolled plate. Trials indicate vulnerability to German 88 mm gun at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The 90 mm M3 gun performs comparably to the German 88 mm Kweoke 36, but falls short of the performance demonstrated by our 100 mm D10 or the German 88 mm Ka 43 found on the Tiger II. Penetration of highly sloped armor, specifically Panther-type plates, is only possible with scarce HVAP ammunition. Standard ammunition proves inadequate. Here was America's answer to German super-heavy tanks, their heavy breakthrough vehicle, their solution to the Panther problem, and by Soviet standards, established through 4 years of mechanized warfare against the Wehrmacht, it didn't measure up. But what bothered Fedorov most wasn't the armor or even the gun. It was the philosophy behind it. The Americans had built a tank that prioritized production speed over battlefield dominance. They'd designed a vehicle that was good enough, not exceptional. Cast armor, because it was faster to manufacture. An engine from their medium tank, because designing a new power plant took time they didn't have. A gun that was adequate with special ammunition, but merely acceptable without it. The IS-2, by contrast, had been designed from the beginning to survive and kill. 120 mm of frontal armor, because anything less was unacceptable. A 122 mm gun, because they needed to destroy German bunkers and tanks alike. Weight be damned, production difficulty be damned. The tank had to win. And yet, as Fedorov reviewed his notes late into the June nights, a troubling realization emerged. The Americans had won. The Pershing arrived in Germany too late to matter tactically. Only 20 saw combat, but America had produced over 2,000 by war's end. They had shipped them across an ocean. They had deployed them while still debugging mechanical issues. They had, in short, done what the Soviets did with the T-34, built something good enough in quantities great enough to overwhelm. The IS-2 was magnificent, superior to the Pershing in armor, competitive in firepower, but only 2,250 were ever built. Meanwhile, the Americans had produced 50,000 Shermans. 50,000. The mathematics of industrial war didn't care about elegance. It cared about numbers. By late July, the final report was complete. The T-26E3, while designated as a heavy tank, does not meet Soviet standards for armor protection or firepower. It is, by our classification, better suited to the medium tank role. The classification was harsh, but accurate. In May 1946, the Americans would reach the same conclusion. The Pershing would be officially reclassified as a medium tank, not because it had failed, but because the definition of a heavy tank had evolved beyond what America needed or wanted to build. There was a deeper lesson in Kubinka's findings, one that Soviet engineers recognized, even if they didn't say it aloud in official reports. The Pershing's armor couldn't stop an 88 mm gun reliably. But Germany had lost. The Pershing's gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's glacis without tungsten rounds, but the Panthers were now scrap metal rusting in French fields. The Americans hadn't built the best tank. They'd built the tank they could afford to lose. And in a war of attrition, that mattered more than any ballistic table. Fedorov closed his report with a final observation. It is recommended that future Soviet heavy tank development maintain minimum frontal armor of 120 mm. The American approach, while industrially efficient, is unsuited to Soviet tactical doctrine. Our tanks must survive, not merely achieve numerical superiority. The words were professional, measured, but underneath them, an unspoken truth. The Americans had sent their newest heavy tank across the world as a gesture of alliance. The Soviets had tested it and found it wanting, not because the Pershing was poorly designed, but because two different countries, fighting two different wars, had arrived at two different answers to the same problem. How do you kill a tiger? The answer, the Soviets concluded, was to build a tank the tiger couldn't kill first. The Americans concluded differently. Build enough tanks that losing some didn't matter. Both approaches won the war. But only one philosophy would survive into the peace. The Pershing at Kubinka became something of a curiosity over the following months. Soviet tankers training at the proving grounds would occasionally request permission to drive it. The Americans had included a full technical manual, translated painstakingly into Russian by military linguists who struggled with terms like torque-matic transmission and gyrostabilizer. What struck the Soviet crews most wasn't the armor or the gun, it was the comfort. The turret basket rotated with the turret, keeping the crew in position. The seats had cushions. Actual cushions. The driver's compartment had more headroom than a 34. The periscopes were clear, well-positioned, offered good visibility. One lieutenant, after spending an hour inside, emerged, shaking his head. "It's like they designed this tank for people who wanted to live," he said. His commander, a veteran of Kursk, laughed. "Comrade, we design our tanks for people who are going to die, but who will kill many fascists first." The comment was meant as a joke, but it captured something true about the two design philosophies. Soviet tanks were built for decisive engagements. Close range, high casualties expected, victory through breakthrough and exploitation. American tanks were built for a war of movement. Long supply lines, sustained operations. Crew survival valued because replacing trained men was harder than replacing machines. Neither approach was wrong. But when Soviet engineers test-fired captured German documents detailing American tank performance in Europe, a different picture emerged. One that didn't match the Kubinka test results. Field reports from German units that engaged Pershings near Cologne, near Dessau, along the Weser River. Enemy heavy tank, designation unknown, engaged our Panther at 900 meters. First round penetrated mantlet. Tank destroyed. Another report. American heavy tank with long gun destroyed Tiger from defensive position. Crew reports extremely high velocity round. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The discrepancy troubled Fedorov. In controlled testing at Kubinka, the Pershing's standard ammunition failed against Panther-type armor. But in combat, Pershings were killing Panthers frontally. How? The answer came from an unexpected source. Intelligence reports from occupied Germany. Technical interrogations of captured Wehrmacht tank crews. American tactical doctrine. The Soviets had tested the Pershing as they would test an IS-2. Stand-up engagement, tank versus tank, 700 meters, fire until someone dies. The Americans fought differently. They didn't duel. They hunted. Pershing crews in Germany had been trained to use terrain, to wait, to let German tanks close to 400 meters before engaging. At that range, even without HVAP, the 90mm gun could defeat a Panther's turret face, could penetrate the gun mantlet, could exploit weaknesses that didn't exist at longer ranges. More importantly, American doctrine emphasized combined arms. Pershings rarely fought alone. They operated with infantry, with artillery, with air support. A Pershing might spot a Panther at 1,000 meters and simply call in a P-47 Thunderbolt strike. Why risk a tank duel when you could drop 500 pounds of high explosive from the sky? The Soviets did this too, of course, but their doctrine assumed the tank itself would do the killing. American doctrine assumed the tank was one tool among many. This fundamental difference explained everything. The Pershing didn't need to be invulnerable because it would never fight alone. It didn't need a gun that could penetrate anything from any range because it would choose the range. It didn't need to survive a hit from a Tiger because American air superiority meant Tigers rarely got the first shot. August 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was over. At Kubinka, the Pershing sat in its testing bay, covered by a tarp, mission complete. Fedorov's report had been filed. The conclusions were clear. By Soviet standards, the heavy tank 26E3 was inadequate. The question became, what to do with this information? The answer shaped Soviet tank development for the next decade. The IS-3, already in production, would continue. The IS-4 program would proceed. Plans for the IS-7 super heavy tank, 70 tons, 100 to 30mm gun, would move forward. The Soviets had tested the American approach and rejected it. They would build fewer tanks, but each tank would be a fortress, each gun would be a siege weapon. The Americans, meanwhile, looked at their own data and reached the opposite conclusion. The Pershing had performed adequately in combat despite its limitations. This suggested that adequate, produced in quantity, was strategically superior to excellent, produced in scarcity. The M46 Patton program began. Essentially an upgraded Pershing, better engine, better transmission, same armor, same gun. Not a revolutionary leap, an evolutionary step. The divergence in philosophy would define the Cold War. Soviet heavy tanks grew heavier. The 10, 52 tons, remained in service until the 1960s. Heavily armored, powerful gun, slow, complex, expensive. American tanks grew more balanced. The M47, the M48, the M60. None were heavy tanks in the Soviet sense. All prioritized reliability, mobility, and producibility over pure armor thickness. By the 1950s, Western analysts looking at Soviet heavy tanks saw intimidating monsters: 120mm of frontal armor, 122mm guns, built to smash through NATO lines in a hypothetical World War III. Soviet analysts looking at American medium tanks saw a different kind of threat. Thousands of them, all with adequate armor, adequate guns, adequate speed, not exceptional in any category, but present in overwhelming numbers. Neither side understood that they were preparing for different wars. The Soviets expected another desperate defensive struggle on their own soil, short, brutal engagements, survival of individual tanks paramount because each one cost months of production. The Americans expected expeditionary warfare, long campaigns, global logistics, individual tanks expendable because the factory could make more. The truth about the Pershing's armor would have surprised both sides. In 1947, American engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground conducted their own comprehensive tests, not against German armor, against Soviet armor, captured IS-2 plates, 120mm thick. The results were classified. But years later, when the documents were declassified, they told a story that would have shocked the Kubinka testers. The Pershing's 90mm gun with HVAP could penetrate an IS-2's frontal armor at 800 meters. The IS-2's 122mm gun could penetrate a Pershing's frontal armor at over 1,500 meters. On paper, the Soviet tank won decisively. In practice, it was more complicated. The Pershing's gun fired faster, 12 aimed rounds per minute versus 3 for the IS-2. The Pershing could traverse its turret in 10 seconds. The IS-2 needed 19. The Pershing's crew could spot targets faster thanks to better optics. The IS-2's crew had to muscle massive two-piece ammunition in cramped conditions. If two equally trained crews met in open terrain at 1,000 meters, the IS-2 would probably win. It had the armor to survive the first hit and the gun to end the fight with one shot. But wars aren't fought in open terrain by equally trained crews at convenient ranges. They're fought in rubble, in forests, in towns, at 300 meters or 3,000, with airstrikes, with artillery, with ambushes, with confusion. In that environment, the Pershing's advantages, small individually, compounded. The Korean War proved this in ways that surprised everyone. When North Korean 3485s rolled south in June 1950, the Americans rushed Pershings to the peninsula. Same tank tested at Kubinka 5 years earlier, same engine, same gun. But, now fighting a war it was actually designed for. The results were decisive. Pershings destroyed 3485s at ranges where the Soviet tanks couldn't even see them. American crews, trained to exploit terrain and use superior optics, engaged from hull-down positions. By the time North Korean tank crews spotted the Pershings, it was too late. The 90mm gun, adequate against Panthers, was devastating against 34s. Penetration from any angle, at any combat range. The Chinese, when they intervened, brought IS-2 tanks, heavier, more dangerous. In December 1950, the first engagement between a Pershing and an IS-2 occurred near the Chosin Reservoir. The IS-2 fired first, missed. The Pershing's gunner, Corporal John Baker, didn't have HVAP, just standard M82 armor piercing. He aimed not for the glacis, but for the turret ring, the weakest point on any tank, where the turret meets the hull. Even the IS-2 had less than 100 millimeters there. The 90 millimeter round struck just below the turret face, penetrated. The IS-2's ammunition detonated. The turret lifted 3 feet off the hull and crashed back down, canted at an angle. Baker would later receive a Bronze Star, but the real lesson wasn't his marksmanship. It was that American training emphasized shooting for weak points. Soviet doctrine, expecting close-range brawls, emphasized frontal penetration. In Korea, where engagements often occurred at ranges beyond 500 meters, weak-point targeting proved decisive. The Pershing, inadequate by Soviet standards, dominated because it fought smart rather than strong. Back at Kubinka, the 26 E3 serial number 30119961 sat largely forgotten. Occasionally, engineers would reference it when designing new systems. The turret traverse mechanism influenced Soviet designs. The suspension was studied. The fire control system, primitive by later standards, still offered insights. But the tank itself became a museum piece, a curiosity, evidence of American industrial might but tactical confusion. Or so it seemed to Soviet designers who never fought in it, never experienced what it was like to command a tank where you could actually see the battlefield, where the gun laid on target in seconds, where the crew wasn't cramped into a steel coffin. There's a photograph from 1948, Soviet tank designers visiting Kubinka, standing next to the Pershing. One of them, Alexander Morozov, designer of the 34, is smiling. He's pointing at the turret basket, making a joke about American softness. Everyone is laughing, but if you look closely at Morozov's face, there's something else there. Not mockery, curiosity. He's wondering, what if? What if Soviet tanks had better crew ergonomics? What if they prioritized visibility? What if they acknowledged that keeping crews alive and effective mattered as much as armor thickness? These questions would eventually lead to the T-54, the T-55, tanks that balanced Soviet toughness with some American practicality. But in 1948, those designs were still years away, and the men at Kubinka still believed that heavy armor and big guns were the only path to victory. The Pershing's legacy wasn't its armor or its gun, it was its philosophy. That a tank didn't have to be the best to be effective. That industrial capacity was a weapon as powerful as steel. That crew training and doctrine could compensate for technical limitations. The Soviets tested that philosophy at Kubinka in the summer of 1945. They measured it, quantified it, found it wanting. But they misunderstood what they were seeing. They thought they were testing a heavy tank. They were actually testing an idea. The idea that wars are won not by individual weapons but by systems, not by technical excellence but by operational flexibility, not by building the tank that survives every hit, but by building the tank you can afford to lose. Years later, when Soviet tankers captured American equipment in proxy wars across the world, they would sometimes report back with observations that echoed Fedorov's original assessment. American tanks are comfortable, well designed, but their armor is inadequate. And yet, those inadequate tanks kept winning. In the Six-Day War, Israeli M48s, upgraded Pershings essentially, destroyed hundreds of Soviet-built tanks. In Vietnam, American armor dominated despite fighting in terrain that should have negated every advantage. The pattern repeated across decades. Soviet tanks, superior on paper, struggled against American tanks that were merely adequate. The explanation, when military historians finally acknowledged it, was uncomfortable. Technical specifications mattered less than people wanted to believe. The side with better training, better logistics, better combined arms integration, better intelligence, won regardless of armor thickness. The Pershing proved this, not through its victories, which were few in World War II, but through its mere existence. The Americans had looked at the Tiger, the Panther, the IS-2, all the heavy tanks of the war, and decided not to match them. Instead, they built something different, something that didn't try to out-armor or outgun the competition, something that tried to outthink it. At Kubinka, Soviet engineers tested the armor and found it thin, tested the gun and found it adequate, tested the mobility and found it acceptable. But they never tested the doctrine. They never tested the idea that a tank's effectiveness wasn't measured by what it could survive, but by what it could achieve. They never asked the question that would have changed everything. Not, can this tank win a duel? But can an army of these tanks win a war? The answer, proven in Germany and Korea and a dozen other conflicts, was yes. The Pershing at Kubinka was never meant to be the best tank in the world. It was meant to be good enough. And in the mathematics of industrial warfare, good enough, multiplied by thousands, defeated perfection every time. The final irony of the Kubinka trials wasn't discovered until decades after they concluded. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and archives were opened, researchers found something curious in the original test reports. A footnote, barely legible, written in Fedorov's handwriting. Note: American technical documentation indicates the 26E3 was classified as experimental. First production models only. Improved variants with heavier armor reportedly in development. This vehicle may not represent final American heavy tank doctrine. He was right. While the Soviets tested serial number 301199961 at Kubinka, American engineers were already working on the 26E5, upgraded Pershing. Frontal armor increased to 121 mm, turret face to 203 mm. Precisely the armor thickness Soviet doctrine demanded. The 26E5 never saw mass production. The war ended. Priorities shifted. But its existence revealed something the Kubinka report never could. The Americans knew their armor was inadequate. They'd known from the beginning. The Pershing wasn't their final answer. It was their right now answer. A tank they could build immediately while developing something better. The Soviets, testing only what they received, judged the Americans by a prototype and mistook it for a philosophy. The heavy tank 29, the 30, the 32, American super heavy tank projects that would have shocked the Kubinka engineers. 70 tons, 105mm guns, armor exceeding 150mm. Designs that paralleled Soviet thinking almost exactly. But these tanks remained prototypes. The Americans looked at them, calculated the cost, the logistics, the strategic benefit, and said no. Not because they couldn't build them, because they chose not to. That choice, more than any technical specification, defined the difference between American and Soviet armored warfare doctrine. The Soviets built what they needed to survive. The Americans built what they could afford to deploy. By 1955, the Pershing at Kubinka had been joined by other American vehicles. An M46 Patton, an M47, each tested, each measured, each found wanting by Soviet standards. And each time, Soviet designers walked away convinced of their technical superiority. They weren't wrong about the specifications. Soviet heavy tanks did have thicker armor, more powerful guns. On any technical datasheet, they won. But wars aren't fought on datasheets. In 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, Soviet IS-3 heavy tanks rolled through Budapest. 68 tons of steel. Invulnerable to anything the revolutionaries possessed. Absolute technical dominance. And yet, Hungarian fighters destroyed or disabled 11 of them. Not with better tanks, with Molotov cocktails, with determination, with tactics designed around the IS-3's one fatal flaw. It was too heavy to maneuver in tight urban terrain. The lesson, had anyone been paying attention, was clear. Technical superiority meant nothing without tactical flexibility. The Pershing, with its adequate armor and adequate gun, could have navigated Budapest's streets far more effectively than the mighty IS-3. Not because it was better, because it was smaller, lighter, more practical. The American philosophy vindicated again, not through strength, but through adaptability. 1967, the Six-Day War. Israeli Defense Forces, equipped with upgraded M48 Pattons, descendants of the Pershing, faced Egyptian and Syrian forces equipped with Soviet heavy tanks, IS-3 variants. 10 tanks. Everything the Soviets had designed to be technically superior. The result was catastrophic for the Arab forces. Hundreds of Soviet-built tanks destroyed, Israeli losses minimal. Western analysts attributed this to crew training, to Israeli tactical superiority, to air supremacy. All true. But there was another factor rarely discussed. The Soviet tanks were designed for a war that never happened, a war of massive armoured breakthroughs across European plains, short, decisive engagements, heavy casualties accepted. Israeli tanks were used in a war that did happen, rapid manoeuvre, extended operations in desert heat, sustained combat over days, not hours. The Patterns, with their reliable engines and practical design, could maintain operational tempo. The Soviet heavies, magnificent in short engagements, broke down during sustained operations, overheated, suffered mechanical failures, couldn't keep pace with a mobile, aggressive enemy. Once again, adequate, reliable, and numerous defeated superior, powerful, and scarce. The Soviets never publicly acknowledged these lessons. Internal reports noted the problems. Design bureaus studied the failures. But the doctrine remained unchanged: heavy armour, powerful guns, breakthrough capability. By the 1970s, however, the heavy tank had disappeared from Soviet inventories. The 10, last of the Joseph Stalin line, was retired, replaced by main battle tanks, the T-62, the T-72, tanks that still emphasized armor and firepower, but tanks that finally acknowledged what the Pershing had proven 30 years earlier. You couldn't build a tank so heavy it was invulnerable. You could only build a tank effective enough to win battles and practical enough to build in quantity. The Pershing at Kubinka was eventually moved to the Kubinka Tank Museum, where it sits today, next to Tigers and Panthers and IS-2s, all the great heavy tanks of World War II. Tourists photograph it, tank enthusiasts admire it, museum placards describe its specifications. 100, 1.6 mm, frontal armour, 90 mm gun, 46 tons, crew of 5. The placard doesn't mention the testing, doesn't describe the disappointment Soviet engineers felt, doesn't explain that this tank, judged inadequate in 1945, represented a philosophy that would dominate armoured warfare for the next 50 years. If you visit Kubinka today, you can stand next to serial number 301-19961 and run your hand across the same gun mantlet, Fedorov measured in May 1945. The tank looks small compared to the Soviet heavies around it. The IS-2 looms larger. The IS-3, with its distinctive turtle shell turret, looks more impressive. The experimental IS-7, all 70 tons of it, dwarfs everything. But the Pershing is the only one still philosophically relevant, because modern main battle tanks, American, Russian, Chinese, European, all follow the Pershing's logic, not the IS-2s. They're designed to be good enough in every category, mobile enough to exploit opportunities, survivable enough to complete missions, lethal enough to destroy threats, not invulnerable, not unbeatable, but effective. The doctrine that emerged from Kubinka's testing was built on a misunderstanding. Soviet engineers believed the Pershing represented American heavy tank thinking. It didn't. It represented American pragmatic thinking. The difference shaped the Cold War, shaped tank development, shaped military doctrine across 2 generations. And the misunderstanding was never corrected because both sides won just enough to believe they were right. The Soviets pointed to their technical superiority and saw validation. The Americans pointed to their battlefield victories and saw validation. Neither fully understood what the other was trying to achieve. In 1991, a team of Russian historians visited the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground. They were researching Soviet Lend-Lease equipment, American tanks sent to the USSR during the war. They asked if any records existed of Soviet reactions to American equipment. A curator showed them files, technical reports, test data, including a translated copy of the Kubinka trials on the 26E3, The Russian historians read it in silence. One of them, a former tank officer, finally spoke. "We tested it wrong," he said. "What do you mean?" the curator asked. "We tested it like a Soviet tank, should have tested it like an American tank. Different questions, different scenarios, different doctrine." The curator nodded, asked what different questions they would ask now. The historian thought for a moment. Not, can it survive a hit from a Tiger? Ask, can a crew operate it effectively for a week straight? Not, can it penetrate a Panther's glacis? Ask, can it destroy enough targets to achieve mission objectives? Not, is the armor thick enough? Ask, is the whole system effective enough? Those questions, had they been asked in 1945, would have yielded different answers. The Pershing's armor couldn't stop an 88mm gun reliably, but its crew could fight effectively for extended periods because the ergonomics didn't exhaust them. The gun couldn't penetrate heavy armor frontally with standard ammunition, but it could engage and destroy most threats at most ranges under most conditions. The armor wasn't thick enough by Soviet standards, but the entire system, tank plus doctrine, plus logistics, plus training, was effective enough to win. Soviet testers at Kubinka measured the wrong things, not through incompetence, through perspective. They measured what mattered in Soviet doctrine: armor thickness, gun penetration, frontal engagement capability, all valid metrics. For the war they expected to fight. But America was fighting a different war, and the Pershing was designed for that different war. The final report from Kubinka concluded that the 26E3 was inadequate as a heavy tank, correct by Soviet definition. But the Americans had never intended to build a heavy tank as the Soviets defined it. They'd intended to build a tank heavy enough to fight anything it encountered, light enough to deploy globally, reliable enough to operate continuously, and cheap enough to build in decisive numbers. By those metrics, the Pershing succeeded. The Soviets just never tested those metrics. History judges tanks by whether they won battles. By that standard, both the Pershing and the IS-2 succeeded. Both killed German armor. Both contributed to Allied victory. Both served their nations well. But history also judges tanks by their legacy. By what came after. By what they taught designers. The IS-2 led to the IS-3, the IS-7, the 10, a lineage of heavy tanks that ended in the 1960s when the entire category became obsolete. The Pershing led to the M46, the M48, the M60, and eventually the Mohn Abrams, a lineage of main battle tanks that continues today. The doctrinal descendants of that inadequate tank tested at Kubinka now serve in over 20 armies worldwide. The Mohn Abrams, 62 tons, 120mm gun, composite armor. On paper, it looks like the Soviets won the argument. Heavy armor, powerful gun, battlefield dominance. But look closer. The Abrams can operate continuously for 72 hours. Its crew can fight effectively because the ergonomics prioritize human factors. Its logistics train can keep it supplied across continents. Its design emphasizes not just surviving hits, but avoiding them through mobility and situational awareness. It's a Pershing at heart, just one that learned from 70 years of tank warfare. The tank the Soviets would have built had they asked different questions at Kubinka. Had they tested not just the armor and gun, but the philosophy behind them. Today, the Pershing at Kubinka sits silent, its engine cold, its gun empty. Museum visitors see an old tank. Military historians see a technical curiosity, but tankers, those who've actually fought in armored vehicles, see something different. They see the moment American and Soviet tank doctrine diverged. They see the test that shaped the Cold War. They see proof that the most important question isn't what can this tank survive, but what can this tank achieve. Major Nikolai Fedorov died in 1978. He never knew that his test subject, that inadequate American heavy tank, would influence tank design for the next half-century. He never knew that the philosophy he dismissed would become the standard. He never knew that adequate, when multiplied by 10,000, defeats perfection every time. His report sits in Russian archives, yellowed, fragile, a historical document, but its conclusions echo across decades. The 26E3 does not meet Soviet standards for a heavy tank. Correct, because Soviet standards were built for Soviet wars, and America was fighting different wars, with different tools. According to different rules, the Pershing proved you could win without being the best, just by being good enough, often enough, in enough places. That truth, tested and rejected at Kubinka in 1945, became the foundation of modern armoured warfare, not because the Soviets were wrong, but because they were asking different questions, fighting different battles, building for different futures. Both answers worked, until only one survived. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.